Heather O'Neill is a novelist, short story writer, and essayist. Her work, which includes Lullabies for Little Criminals, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, Daydreams of Angels, and The Lonely Hearts Hotel, has been shortlisted for the Governor-General's Award for Fiction, the Orange Prize for Fiction, and the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and has won CBC Canada Reads, the Paragraphe Hugh MacLennan Prize for Fiction, and the Danuta Gleed Literary Award. She lives in Montreal, where we currently are, to talk about, among other things, Wisdom in Nonsense, the Canadian Literature Centre Kreisel Lecture series.
Yes.
And you gave that in 2017?
Yeah, it was last year.
Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Just like to work my way through this with you if I could.
Okay.
But first, hating your life is an acceptance of your circumstance. To love your life is an act of rebellion, a declaration of its worth. That's you.
Yes.
So, are you actively trying to love your life because you hate it?
No, I think that I do love my life, and I've always had a sense of loving it, even though I feel that through my childhood and my life I've had some sort of exceptional obstacles to overcome, and I've been in positions where people would objectively look at my life and say it's a terrible one, but I think even as a child I was working against that, because I had such a sense of, I had this natural inclination towards happiness, or knew what it was, and my sense of wonder and being amazed at certain things was so dear to me. And whenever I was amazed by something, I just felt inherently that was part of me too, because I was able to observe it. So I had a love of life, even though I was able to distinctly separate myself from the circumstances I was living in.
That's because you were made to feel important, right? Partly? That you had self-worth? Or is that just made up? Is that a lie? Because you do say that in your lecture, I think.
I do. I don't, it's one's relationship with one's parent. It's like a complicated one.
Telling me.
And it's interesting because you might sometimes have the impression that when someone dies, it's the end of your relationship, but then it's what I found kind of interesting with my father and I was that it was such an evolving relationship too, and there are times when we're getting along really well, and there's times when I'm just furious with him, and so we go through stages together, and it's like even a more sort of complicated relationship now that he's passed away, because it all kind of exists in the realm of the spirit, and then I just go back to different times. So
you can't vent your anger on him now. Well, you can, but he won't respond.
But maybe in a way because I suppose in a lot of ways I think because it was just me and my dad that I felt I was also so responsible for him being happy, and then I had like some kids do, like you end up having to parent a bit yourself. So I think the burden and I was always kind of preoccupied and worried that he would be sad. So I think that one now, it's almost like I can have a more honest appraisal of things that went on in my childhood. Who knows? I'm also just having this introspective year because I started writing a memoir, and then it's brought up a lot of complicated things. So it's funny because nonfiction is so much harder in a way to pin down than fiction, because fiction naturally has its own like parameters, and like you wouldn't think
doesn't have parameters.
No, you would think, but it's like if you create something in fiction, that becomes the truth. You can play with the narrative, but you kind of are creating the physics of it, whereas the truth and what actually happened, you have sort of no control over. It's very difficult to access or have some claim over something that happened in the real world, because there's other people who are also witness to it who would have completely different narratives, and even your own experience doesn't quite belong to you in the same way. It's like a tricky, fickle thing, and I'm like, I want to just like pin you down the way I can pin down fiction, and it's hard. And it's always like in fiction, you create the tone and what you want it to say, but then with real life, it defies you.
That puts me in mind of Hamlet's ghost, the father, the ghost. Now, if he'd seen it on his own, then you might say it was a figment of his imagination. But there's Horatio and another guy. I can't remember his name. But the point is, at least in the reader's mind, it isn't just his own imagination, because there have been other people that saw it as well.
Yeah, there's another interesting thing about if you're writing speaking about anything in one's life that's abusive, one usually doesn't have witnesses. So, it's come up lately in like the Me Too movement, but it also comes up in writing, or anyone who's experienced abuse, is you are actually writing in a place where you have no other witnesses, and you're inviting the reader in to be a witness, and you're asking that the reader like believe you. And that's just an issue.
Just like
with people, with victims in general, is that
you want people to believe you.
Yeah, because you have no witness, and you're just going to have to believe Hamlet without all his friends.
It's a he said, she said situation.
Yeah.
So who do you believe? And you can't really, if you want to take it to the legal courts, they tend to rule against women or victims.
Well, the legal system is created to protect those in power in all circumstances. It's created to keep the status quo. So there's naturally, for women, there's sort of no recourse to justice in it, but that's why there's starting to be these new movements wherein women find justice, in which people are saying, particularly men, that these are unjust in mobs, and but it's not. It's a form of women being heard.
But because you can't get heard through the legal structure, and if you can't get heard there, then
and the legal structure is such that it limits your voice, and it tells you how to speak and when you can speak.
And it also gets guilty people off the hook, it seems.
Yeah, it totally protects them. Whereas this is sort of a movement that was created by women in a way that directly impacts perpetrators.
I think the problem is, though, that now we're getting way out of our, not depth, but the original intent of our discussion. But it's obviously very interesting, and it's part of CanLit like almost nothing else right now. So I heard you talk on the radio some months ago about Concordia, and I assume that might have something to do with your memoir and bringing all this up.
Not really. It was actually interesting. Like I had not thought really about what had happened to me at Concordia, and it wasn't really part of my memoir or something that I was working on. But then I had heard, I knew that there were some young women who were coming forward, and they were being threatened with litigation and just being called liars. And then at that point I felt, having been through it myself, that I really, I had a responsibility towards these younger women.
To support them.
Yeah, and I was like, I can't. And it's not something that I wanted to do or talk about, because it just makes you feel miserable, and there's certain, you expose yourself. But I was like, I can't. Like, I can't in any good conscience or write about things I do and then not come forward and support, like, these young women in any way that I can. So it was just a moment when I was like, okay, I'm there for you guys. Because I always felt, too, that when I reflect back on things that had happened, I wonder, like, okay, well, where were the older women in these circumstances who could have been, like, policing or monitor, or just been there for me at all. So
nothing's really come of that to this point. I suppose it's all bogged down in legal.
Yeah, I think things have come of it, though.
Things have come of it because individuals are no longer working there, you mean?
Yeah, and I think there's and I think for the students who are there now, it's been they've been made aware of how these situations are an abuse of power, and that's also what I wanted to show from, like, sometimes it's harder when you're younger and you're in it, but then from the perspective of being older, and I look back on it and I see just how blatantly it was an abuse of power, and how it just kind of really undercut my sense of self-esteem and self-worth, and how that was so, like, pernicious, and how it could, and people mock it and pretend it's not, like, significant, that sort of constant, like, harassment that goes on, but they don't realize the degree to which it can affect a young woman's education and her attempt to kind of move forward in that world. So I think when I was describing it, I was just very being factual of, like, this is what happened, this is how it made me feel, and this is kind of the after effects. So I just wanted that voice to be out there for students and young women or young men or whatever, and for them to know that they have a right, if they feel upset by this, to know that it is they are being wronged, and they have a legitimate beef, whether it's not, like, written into the actual, like, school regulations or not. It's like we're at a moment when we can challenge laws even if they exist, like, even if it's in the Concordia, like, the rules that professors and students can sleep together, that doesn't mean that it's right or acceptable in any sort of literary community.
So thanks to this movement, students can voice their concerns or complaints without fear of being blacklisted or going unpublished. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think, the problem is you're still always going to be afraid of litigation, but I think it's like, it just, it polices the actions a little more, and it makes the professors think twice. And I think also in this climate, I think you would have a lot more difficulty as a professor moving up with that sort of behavior, whereas before it was condoned. So
I think, the thing is, too, though, it is open to abuse. That's, I think, one of the concerns from the male perspective, is that their reputations will get completely shattered if someone decides to accuse them of something. I mean, that's the male concern, I guess. Yeah,
but it happens so rarely. It's an irrational concern, and it's just like women usually, when they come forward, it's the psychological toll that takes on you. Like, nobody comes forward unless they have a legitimate complaint. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you're gonna say, like, maybe in like 1,000 cases, one woman's gonna be a liar, therefore we should not believe women at all, it becomes absurd. But the terror that men are feeling is a good thing, because everybody, we tried asking them nicely for decades, and there was no change. So we had to instill a little terror.
Okay. Speaking of lying, or telling the truth, novelists, poets lie to tell the truth. They're editing the real world, aren't you?
Is that something you're saying?
I'm pretty sure I picked that out of
All right, are you
Wisdom
quoting me?
in Nonsense. I'm paraphrasing you.
Oh, okay.
I'm agreeing with you and paraphrasing you.
Yeah, it's definitely a process of editing. I mean, I think we do that in real life too, when we create like anecdotes, and there's a way in which we just naturally edit everything we say in order to create a certain meaning with it.
I think that's and our memory is not the best.
No,
and again, this going back to Me Too. I think that's one of the problems. Is in a court, your stories, even if they are true, the details may not be accurate, and that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah, memory's funny too, because we edit. We also edit our own story in order to kind of have our lives be the kind of novel that we want it to be. And one reason I'm sort of glad I don't have like a lot of photographs from when I was a teenager, because I just prefer my own sort of, like I've created of those teenage years, like such a beautiful, strange, dark, but like Narnia-like memory of it, that sort of, and I'm glad there's kind of no actual documentation. But what's interesting now with like young people is because with selfies and stuff, they're just basically creating their own photographs, so they're sort of editing and making their life into a narrative as they go along. So I'm just glad there's none of those sort of terrible old snapshots with red eyes. I'm like, how does this capture that magnificent world? It must be me in some awkward pose in a t-shirt.
But yeah, we kind of retroactively make a story out of our lives, I think. That's why that happened. It's because I was on my way to this.
Yeah, and then sometimes when something like kind of monumental happens, and we go back and we completely like reorder it and re-edit it, and then that's when people have an existential crisis, because you're like, oh my god, I have to like edit this book so much. I was like, yeah, and people going through divorces, and they're going back, and they're like, no, that person wasn't important. It's not a main character, not a main character. Yeah, it's like storytelling in the way, like it's just the natural part, the way that our minds work within the context of stories. So, and what did I say?
Well, I said that you said a novelist lies to tell the truth and edits the real world.
Yeah, I know that feeling too, because sometimes it's also we're trying to capture in a way like feelings that you had or a reaction, and sometimes actually telling the event doesn't capture the psychic impact of it. So the actual way to communicate the psychic impact would be to create like like you're getting your head eaten off by a dragon or something, and then because that would more accurately reflect the state of your heart or something.
You need something that kind of momentous to explain that's
exactly,
this was really, really painful, or this was really exciting, or whatever.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, I keep getting back to like abuse and stuff, but like with childhood, abuse is interesting too, because when it happens, one doesn't have the language or even like the linguistic sort of our logical structures we're in to capture or describe what happened or to make it into a narrative. So you've experienced this abuse, but it's also been perpetrated on someone who's living in a time where you're still in a metaphorical world. So then when one creates fiction, it's through this shattered world where you have to describe the abuse in the language wherein it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were abused as like a 7-year-old, then if you want real access to that abuse, it's created in your memory of it, and the way it's stored in your brain is through very like childlike imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of times
you have to kind of go back to that period in your life.
Yeah, and
with your mind.
And you won't have access to it through logical language. Mm-hmm. And I think and I do think that there's a lot of because I've spoken to people who are victims of abuse and myself, and it's like there is a certain there's a difficulty of articulating it, and
because partly it happened when you were young, so you didn't have the vocabulary, but also partly because the pain kind of
it's the horror of it that
keep you away from it.
Yeah, I mean, because like words always contain things, and the horror of it just kind of refuses to be contained. And I think so a lot of people a lot of fiction writers will move into science fiction or these completely magical, radical worlds wherein they can somehow kind of harness the horror of what happened because it almost seems, I don't know what it is, it's something I'm exploring, so I don't know if it's why it is after abuse you develop mutism sometimes where you just can't even speak.
Like Maya Angelou.
Yeah, it's like a definite experience, and you just it becomes very difficult to speak anymore. And I don't know if it's because one feels after those moments that language would trivializes what happened, or somehow language is of the world and you can't rely on it anymore because it's so part of the powers that be.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, it's so logical too.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have a great line here, and I'm going to quote this one directly. Lying is telling the truth in a metaphorical way.
Yeah.
Which, as I say, that's humorous, but in the real world, lying isn't humorous at all. Mm. It causes relationships to break, and if it's serious enough and has to do with money, you get thrown in jail.
I suppose, that's more lying in order to deceive. So I see that more as deception. But in line, I think when I was talking about that line, I was talking about how sometimes, because I was talking in the context of my father who would just lie all the time, but it would be more that it was a lie because the lies were creating the sort of person that he wanted to be, and that the world he kind of wished we were living in. So I think sometimes when people lie about something, it's just they're just presenting their wish to you and what they wish was their reality.
Yeah, like the way he wrote blank checks to you.
Yeah.
Big ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in some cases, I'm more forgiving of lying when it comes from a place of loss, and you're trying to kind of elevate yourself for a person and for that person to love you more. Mm-hmm. And it's just you just don't have
or to show you love too.
Yeah. It's just you don't, it's almost I don't have everything that I want to give you because I think you're so worthy that I would give you everything, and I would be a much better person because you deserve a much better person than me. So I'm forgiving of that kind of lying, and I think it's in the realm of storytelling. But yeah, deception, that is an attempt to steal other people's worlds and to limit them, and it's a form that's a terrible narcissism too, because you're assuming that you have some sort of right over their lives. So yeah, that's more an act of selfishness and hatred, whereas the other one I was talking about is more an act of sheer folly, because you're going to be found out anyways when you start with your big tall tales. But
he wanted you to be treated or to feel like you were the daughter of a philosophy professor rather than a janitor.
Yeah, so he would always, when I applied for school, or when people would ask me what my father did, he would always tell them to say that he was a philosophy professor. And that was a strange thing, because that lie, it actually went a long way for us, because it did cause people who believed that, like adults, to treat me differently, and it did give me a sense in the world of what would be kind of an appropriate kind of job that one could be proud of. And it also forced me somehow to act, or to think of myself as the daughter of a philosophy professor, even though I was not entirely sure what philosophy was, but we just had this idea that it was somehow in the
sounded smart.
Yeah, and that we would be very classy people. So it did give me this sense of, like, I mean, going back to Hamlet, like, if you pretend to be mad long enough, are you actually mad? And it's like, if you go about pretending to be philosophers and children of philosophers, after time, are you not actually philosophers and children of philosophers? So and what is the intrinsic difference, actually, of a child of a professor, philosopher, and one of a janitor? So, and then you just kind of realize all these things are sort of, a lot of them are shallow and come from how life is especially for children, is so much about circumstance. So
people who want you to believe that class is genetic, those kind of people, and that you are less of a person than them.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because my dad was very clear that, like, when people know your class, they will treat you differently. So, but then as an adult, I became a writer, of course, and then it's just that sort of awareness of class just became really important to my writing. But
how's that?
I think because I just, as an adult, I think most people, I think that entry into fiction is usually some sort of like radicalization and awareness that you're in a system which is sort of structured to keep you down. And as a child, I didn't quite realize that, but then as an adult, I realized just how much having been raised poor affected the way the world treated me, and how difficult things would be, just even moving into the adult world, and what was expected of me, and where the roles that I was supposed to, like, assume to fill. But yeah, there's definitely a sense of entitlement from people who were born with a little more, that this is their right, and they're somehow more special people.
I think that's the reason that you got out of the poverty, I think, is because you believed, and everyone is special, but you really, your father helped you to believe that, and that's the most important, that you're loved and made to feel special. That's rich.
Yeah, he did give me a sense of, like,
almost like you're better than him, right?
Yeah, he somehow, he kind of, like, cultivated me to be, like, a little bit of a snob, and it was very funny in that sort of environment we were living in. Yeah. But he was just very much, like, constantly, like, that I was, like, smarter than the other kids, that I was, like, better, like, I was, like, the sort of, like, best, shiniest kid in the entire neighborhood.
Well, you're his daughter. Yeah. Of course you're super smart.
Yeah.
I tell my daughters that all the time.
So, and that was, like, a wonderful thing that he did. Like, he did give me a sense that I was destined to, like, for some sort of glory. Even though, I mean, he had no idea what glory actually looked like, but he was like, you're destined for it. Like, go get it, and you can tell me what it is.
Were you able to tell him?
Yeah, I mean...
Because he lived... When did he die?
He died in 2015.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your first book of poetry was written in 1998, or at least published in 1998.
Yeah, was it 98 or 99? I forget.
It says 98 in here.
I guess it was 98.
But you can't believe everything you read. Well, let's now finally get around to Wisdom in Nonsense. This is the lecture that you gave last year. We touched on a number of things, but I'm going to just go through it a little bit more methodically. This is the first lesson. You never keep a diary. I loved the feeling of chronicling my daily adventures in a black journal. It made the events of my life seem, here's those two important and worthy of a novel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. You pretty well ignore all his advice, right?
Yeah.
Which I suppose is typical of a child.
Yeah.
Right. And he said that it was a terrible habit because everything that one wrote down in the diary was ultimately used against a person in court. Okay. I'll skip the tuba lesson. Yeah, here's you're renowned for your metaphors. Mm-hmm. Is that because your dad was great at metaphors or stories about, or not? You just came naturally to that?
Yeah, I'm going to take ownership for that one.
Okay, good. You're looking at the photocopy machine, and the light of the machine moved back and forth as though it was the Aurora Borealis. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got that kind of phosphorescent green, right? Mm-hmm. This is a theme, and that's being alone, loneliness. And in this lesson, never share your scientific research. Mm-hmm. You say that being betrayed was better than being alone.
I think when I was writing that lecture, I mean, the interesting thing about any piece of writing is it kind of reflects a bit of what's happening exactly at the moment you're writing. So I think I was interested really in loneliness at the time I was writing that, and the idea of being alone. And because I guess I've always kind of liked being alone more than most people do, and it took me like a while to realize that was like an acceptable stance in life, because you're just always kind of told to like go out and find the people. And then I was like, but I don't think I like the people. Like, I mean, there's this solitariness that I do really like, but you're constantly throughout your life told it's like a dangerous thing that will kill you off. So I don't know, I'm just interested about like loneliness and the way, but then it's also, there's a strange thing about loneliness, because if you spend too much time alone, then you grow into this kind of, it becomes impossible to communicate, and you become this strange sort of like Samuel Beckett, like Harold Pinter kind of weird character. So I don't know, it's interesting.
Kind of antisocial, and
it becomes difficult to communicate in a strange way.
So it's I'm not quite sure here. So you're sure that it's better to be on your own than to be in an abusive relationship.
Oh, yes.
But a lot of people will stay in a relationship because they fear being on their own.
Yeah, it's one of the most terrifying things for people. Like I was saying, it's like, I mean, I wonder the degree to which we're taught that, but yeah, the way society is kind of created now with the sort of, I feel like the idea of love has even replaced religion, and it's just people are taught from all movies and culture that you're to look for love, and then the idea, and nobody knows what happens if this love doesn't exist, even though romantic love is always, it's a fickle, crazy thing, but
typically ends in tragedy.
Yeah, but we're not taught what happens after happily ever after, or what
because we're being lied to.
Yeah, we're not even shown like what it would be like to be a single woman. So it's like, and
there's lots of novels that reflect that now, anyway.
Yeah, there's starting to be a glut of them, because I think there's just like, there was that terror, and I think a lot of women lived through it, where they were just like, because you get afraid of the unknown.
Yeah.
So in the past few years, there've been books about single women and just women on their own, and like women outside of relationships, and I think that's kind of wonderful. And also because women are becoming like so independent that there's no need actually like financially to stay in an abusive relationship, which was in the past you were stuck in one. So now it's like you can leave unhappy relationships and live on your own. So there was like this need for like, well, what does that look like?
Looks pretty great.
Yeah.
Speaking of looks, when he rode the bus home with me in his arms, he put a blanket over my head so as not to shock anyone.
Yeah.
Accept that you're ugly and move on. But, or maybe you're compensating here, in your book of poetry way back when, you make a poem. There's a very good poem in here about giving birth, called All That Glitters Is Not a Gutter, in which you talk about the doctor saying that your daughter was here's another one, cute as a tennis ball. So you tell your daughter she's as cute as a tennis ball a lot?
She was very cute. It's true.
But you certainly were too.
I'm sure I was. I don't know why my dad was like...
What he was getting at there?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's funny because that's because when I've done the lecture, I've had...
How many times have you done the lecture?
Well, I did it like the first time, and then I read it like at a couple other places, and there have been a lot of women who have come up and they've been like concerned about that my dad used to tell me I was like ugly. And
But was it kind of a funny kind of accusation? He didn't mean it, I guess. Or did he?
Who knows?
Some babies are dreadfully ugly.
Yeah. So
in fact, I just saw he's now 24, 25. Handsome as all get up. Ugliest baby I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah. I know, like, he said, like, my mother started to cry, and then because he kept going on how ugly I was, and then she was like, you don't love the baby, and he's like, yes, I love the baby. I just find the baby ugly.
That's right. You can love ugly things.
Yeah, I've been interested in the idea.
It's evolved, in fact.
Yeah, because I'm interested in the idea of ugliness, too, because I've been reading a lot of Violette Leduc, who considered herself unattractive, and just that sort of, and the kind of rawness of claiming and celebrating like a body that's not conventionally attractive. So
you like the idea of being unique.
I'm really not into this whole accept like conventional standards of beauty, and there's people who through their uniqueness who are not conventionally attractive, but the way they speak and the way they're animated just makes them so incredibly beautiful to me, and that I find a much more interesting kind of beauty.
That explains Jean-Paul Sartre. He was really ugly, and he got laid all the time.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you think you might have slept with Jean-Paul Sartre?
Me?
Yeah.
No, never.
You take this idea of yours to a certain point, but not that far.
Well, it has nothing to do with sexuality.
But a physical appearance and sexuality are pretty closely connected. Or can be. Often are.
Yeah, but I mean, we move in the world and we meet so many people that that's why I think like the romantic relationship is over exaggerated. So I was thinking more like with women that I find beautiful,
who aren't conventionally beautiful.
Right.
But is it because of their brain? or not even that?
I think it's internally. I think conventional beauty only sort of attracts you for like the first couple moments, or it gets very boring, and internal beauty is something that's constantly surprising. Yeah, and I've read like about Lillian Hellman, and you see photographs of her, and then everyone said from her entourage said you can't actually see what she looks like from photographs because she was so charismatic and wonderful that it completely animated her physical appearance. So you would have to see her.
I'm much more interested in a person like that than I am with, a model.
Yeah.
Obviously, though, that's obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's funny too sometimes how like photographs, some people can't be captured in photographs, and you're like, why is that? And it's because it's like their personality is so shiny, and that's actually what you're looking at when you see them.
I had a big photograph in my office for years. A huge woman. She was sort of akimbo, kind of, but sort of squatting. Gigantic. She was on a beach. I want to say Model, Lisette Model. Does that ring a bell? Mm-hmm. The photographer?
Yeah.
And I love that photograph. Like most people would define her as the opposite of beautiful, but there's something about her, just her solid presence that was very appealing.
Yeah, and also she's like, you see her and she looks like a woman who's been loved and who's had her arms around people. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So there's something fascinating about bodies and the stories that they tell and the way we communicate with them.
This is just getting back to lying here. By teaching me to lie about who I was, my dad instilled in me the notion that the differences were actually superficial. They were just outward trappings. And if you were to change coats with a rich person, then you would immediately become one.
I think that's one of the reasons I always loved Charles Dickens, because he always kind of dressed up his hobos. He always made the hobos like as aristocrats. And there was that sort of swapping of places and playing roles.
I don't know why, but in Lullabies for Little Criminals, the protagonist, Baby, she's 12 or 13. Mm-hmm. She reminded me of Paulette Goddard in Modern Times. Mm-hmm. Now, your dad didn't remind me of well, that was a romantic interest with Charlie Chaplin, mm-hmm. but how does that fit? She's kind of making the best out of the situation always.
Yeah, and it's funny. You should reference those films because I do think Charlie Chaplin was like a really seminal influence for me in the way that even the way a lot of my female characters move was really influenced by films of that time, and especially Charlie Chaplin's, and the way his characters kind of dance through their tragedies and make it into the loveliest kind of performance. That has really affected, especially in the past few years, stuff that I've been writing, like physical aesthetics of body movements has really been influenced by that sort of portrayal of poverty and the sort of beautiful like tiptoe. It's like a world where everybody's on tiptoes. So it's natural that you would make that association just because it's one of a big influence on my work, just always that's in my head. I watched all those films. I used to take them out to the library when I was a kid. I watched them there on their little like TVs back when you could watch, go into the TV room and watch a movie.
Then we'll bring in the clowns now. Mm-hmm. And again, I think Chaplin was a big fan of, is his name Marceline? It's like one of he was known as the greatest clown in the world, right around the turn.
Marcel? No, he was later.
I think his name is Marceline. Mm-hmm. Chaplin was influenced by him.
Yeah, Chaplin's like a great sad clown.
And is that what your character is in a way? She's making light of things that are pretty tragic. Like, for example, her mom, quote, dumps her when she's about, 7? Because they take off from Montreal and go down to the States. And then the mom just says, I'm sick of being a mother. I'm sending you back to Montreal to live with your dad. Is that you or is that the character?
That one, that's me. But it's always like whenever you write about yourself, you kind of slip into persona, so it's never quite you. But yeah, I was always interested in sad clowns because they kind of, they did funny things and they went through these mundane actions, but within it they always acknowledged the sadness of things too, and just how sad life is, and how no matter what we're doing, there's tragedy all around us, and we all kind of carry these sad moments, but at the same time we're allowed to perform joy, and we're allowed to just make these kind of glorious exhibitions of our sadness in order to make other people laugh. So there's something that really always just really touched me even as a child with the art of clowning.
Yeah, because again, although your dad is trying, he's an addict. He gets carted off to rehab.
Oh, and Baby you're talking about. Yeah, Baby's definitely a character.
I'm jumping around here. I can't really help it. And Baby has to go into a hostel. You know, it's kind of fun and humorous for sure, but it's also really tragic what's happening to this little person.
Yeah, because I never, I guess that was my first book, and I just never, I was like, well, if I'm gonna enter this world and speak of these types of stories, like, you don't want to pull any punches. And then sort of sometimes with some writers, it's like you'll have the main character spared the worst events, and then you watch kind of tragedy befall those around them. But I was more interested in my hero will be the one who experiences all the worst things, and then nonetheless my hero will be the one who kind of comes through it. I'm interested in the idea of grace and how children live in a state of grace, and there's this idea of things that can happen to a child to make them fall from grace. But I just wanted, in this book, it was like Baby, no matter what happens to her, she never falls from grace, and she's still existing no matter what in the state of grace. And I think I felt that way towards all children in that situation, is that even though these sort of very adult-like things happen to them, like, they don't carry it, and they're not to blame, and they're still as innocent as a child that's like completely protected from the world.
Yeah, there wasn't a moment like there was for me, at least as a reader of Lolita, where I don't know exactly where it was, maybe about a third of the way in, I suddenly realized, wait a minute, this is rape. This is not right. I suppose I was overwhelmed by the beauty and cleverness of the language in the novel. But there was a moment where I was almost, suddenly enlightened that something's wrong here. I didn't get that in your novel, but there is that light and dark that's at play.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, there's something a little, maybe more than a little wicked about being a writer. You kind of lure the reader into uncomfortable places, and they don't actually realize they've gotten to that place until they're there. And then sometimes they get very angry at you and throw your books against the wall. It's like, you gave me all this beauty and sweetness, and then I followed you like a child after the Pied Piper. And you're like, and they look around like, where am I? Why have you brought me into this darkness?
Right. I just wanted to escape. Because they have nothing of value, this is poor people, they bequeath a value onto plain objects, and this in turn makes them cherished. It was not the object, but what it symbolized, what it was supposed to be. That was your dad being a hoarder, and the lesson is know about know about art history.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in, one of the things about my writing and aesthetic is to kind of, instead of just seeing something as ugly, like to embrace it and say, well, what if this was beautiful? And I always like knickknacks just in the sense of the way people collect them, and then people who are what we collect when we have no money to collect anything else, and then how we're just like birds who are always trying to decorate our nest. And I think it's just naturally part of being human that we try and create beautiful things, even if it's like we start collecting like plastic cups from the gas station and then like arranging them in a pattern. So
but your dad
I like
had
that tendency.
these that was the thing.
Yeah.
So many. I interviewed Henry Hitchings is his name. He wrote a book called Browse about bookstores around the world. He edited it, and it's kind of a nerdy conversation. But we both really agreed about how, I've got thousands of books, and I know the story of each one. I don't have a very great memory, but I know the story about each one of those books, where I got it, why I got it. And he did the same sort of thing. He embellished, obviously, but you didn't care because it was so interesting to listen to the stories and he brought you these things, right? These weird little things.
Yeah, and so each one was like, each one was a beautiful story. So, and I think that, we collect for all sorts of reasons. To, like you were saying, sometimes to like encapsulate a memory, and they all have to do with stories. So with my dad, they were just like invented stories of where he had found this incredibly cheap object.
But obviously, the fact that it's connected to an interesting story makes it valuable. And
it totally does, because it's like the little, almost like a book that you put on the shelf, but it's like a little object that contains that story.
I think we collect partly to make sense of the world, or to try and order the world a little bit. That's possibly one reason.
That's possible too. That's why I always get like uncomfortable in the country, and I feel like if every tree had a little number on it, then I would be okay. But there's just like no order to this.
Crime does pay. Let's listen, number 8. As a child, I was crazy about cheese, so in the evenings my father would stop at select grocery stores to steal the most expensive cheese. Now, for me, reading that's love. Even though breaking the law was not a great moral dilemma for him. So that's the question, is it? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I'm trying to think of something. There's something in the Odyssey that connects with this, but it's like putting your house, Odysseus was putting his house in order when he came back home to his wife Penelope. How did he do that? He slaughtered a whole bunch of suitors. But that's okay because he's putting his house in order. I don't know if that's a bit of too much of a leap here, but your dad is breaking the law by going and ripping off cheese because he knows you love it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That makes ripping off the cheese okay. Does it or doesn't it?
I think in this context, retrospectively, on an objective level, I would probably say no, because it probably put him in peril of being arrested for stupid stuff and not being a good parent. But
and being away from you,
yeah, and just silliness. But there was something nice in the risk he took for that, to please this sort of absolutely unnecessary taste that I had.
The takeaway from this was that I should not settle for what was offered to me in life. I should want more than what my father could afford, and I was expected to find methods other than stealing to get them. Did he tell you not to steal?
Yes.
Okay. So do as I say, not as I do.
Acquire what I acquire, but through other means, for the love of God.
For him, the mark of a fine suit was that it had been stolen.
It's so true. It would always be like, this suit was stolen, because it's the only way he thought one could acquire a really expensive suit, which actually was probably true in his case. So, yeah, that was like his, if something was really, he was really bragging about it, it was like stolen.
Yeah, he really wanted to be like a big-time gangster, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what you admired the most?
I think so, just because in his, I think it was probably the path that he was the best at, or that he kind of was the one in which he had some success. And, you know, he's like born in the late 20s, so it was a time when, I don't know, being that sort of heyday of gangsters, when the opportunities just opened up. And there was an open call for gangsters.
It was a great movie. There's a couple of movies I like. Miller's Crossing. I don't know if you've seen that. It's great. And is it Bugsy, where Warren Beatty, he's in Vegas?
I never saw it.
Did you watch gangster movies with him?
Yeah.
Right in the middle of lesson 10.
Mm-hmm.
Full disclosure, he was an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
So what? All because you really do sugarcoat all of this, but he was an asshole.
I think it's okay to have a complicated feeling. I think it's okay to love parents who are assholes. I think in certain cultures, it's like a lot easier to embrace like a flawed parent, but I think there's something weirdly like in the sort of modern like white patriarchal world where if you like nobody kind of like achieves the whatever our standards are for parenthood, and everyone just like hates and kind of disrespects their parents. It's just like a very strange sort of thing. So I don't know, there's like a little give and take. We expect too much from our kids, we expect too much from our parents. I think we all just need to just like chill out. I'm not being particularly eloquent on that point.
Well, you were not ashamed of yourself or the way your father was, which was what made you an artist and not a criminal.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, maybe what I was getting at before, when you're ashamed of things, you just end up lying and hiding them, and then you end up staying in the kind of the world of secrecy, and the world of secrecy is sort of a prison within itself. But if when you become sort of open and honest about who you are, and like with other people, but also in this kind of larger understanding with yourself, it kind of opens up your possibilities to the world. I don't know, there's something about secrets and shame that really it keeps you always hiding away from opportunities, because you're always worried about being found out and being in places you're not supposed to be. So it kind of
like a counterfeit?
Yeah, if I go there, they'll know that I'm like a counterfeit. But if you go in and it's like, hey, I'm a counterfeit, look at the work on me.
Everyone's a counterfeit.
Yeah, exactly.
Just closing down here, and typically when I say that, we go for at least another half an hour, but I'll say it anyway. We're in the Plateau. Are we still in the Plateau?
Yeah.
Montreal?
Yeah, we're on the Plateau.
Physically?
Yes.
Okay, great. Because Michel Tremblay, great Quebec novelist, dramatist, was very influenced by this area and wrote about it for years, 50 plus years. Mordecai Richler, his terrain as well. And you write about it. So what is it about this place? And how do you interact with those writers, if at all?
I would definitely say like Michel Tremblay was a much bigger influence on me than Mordecai Richler. Yeah, I loved like Tremblay's novels and plays when I was young, and it was such an exciting feeling to be reading literature that was happening on the streets where I lived, And I don't know, there is definitely, I think, especially with the Plateau, like, it's an area that there's always like nooks and crannies in different cities that somehow do this, or the people who live there do this, but it is an area that romanticizes itself. And there's sort of like, when you live there, and if you live here on the Plateau, there is like an effort, and like one of the kind of things that go into living in the Plateau is like, yes, you'll put your garbage out on such a night, but also you will contribute to the romanticization of this place, and you'll like kind of live in a kind of fairy tale way and pretend it's more glamorous than it is. So there's always there's this like very shabby chic, nostalgie debout, like bohemian quality to the Plateau, which I don't know. I mean, I just absolutely fell in love with it as a kid. I was rarely home as a kid. I was always just out on the street.
But what is it?
What is it?
Yeah. What's the appeal?
Well, it's just, first of all, like, it doesn't have the same class divide.
Because it used to be working class.
Yeah.
But
so
it's now pretty trendy. Well, has been for, the last 10 years or more?
Yeah, probably more. It's still like, it's still a wonderful place to live as an artist because the rent is like affordable. I think because there are just so many artists living in this neighborhood.
All kinds of artists.
Yeah. There's a vibrancy to it that you always feel whenever artists move into a place. Yeah, it's fun because I was reading a book by Richard Florida, and he was saying that a city's healthy when you have like the artists show up and like move into places, and because artists have kind of this sense of like where creativity is happening and where it's a spot for possibilities of new ideas, and where you can just concentrate and like work on something new. So when the artists leave, the city is dying, but when artists start to congregate, it means that the city is thriving.
You're very interested in this area, this neighborhood, and it shows up in your novels a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's become like it's also, the neighborhood in my novel is not quite the neighborhood that exists. It's kind of sort of almost magical realist version of Montreal, and each time in each novel that kind of builds, and it's like almost as if I'm doing through like my own, like a sort of world building of a certain Montreal that is not quite this Montreal, but it's like parallel.
Why isn't it this Montreal? Because you made it up.
Yeah, and it's so it's like Montreal is described, as we're talking about an editorial process before, but it's Montreal described to the details of the things, drawing attention to the things that I like the most. So it's particularly how I see Montreal and the things that I find pretty about it.
Like what?
The things, just like the different details of buildings, or the certain parks, or whatever. Like it's totally a montage of the pretty things that I like.
So you've got a pretty filter on.
Yeah, I mean, pretty kind of seems like trivial, but it's like appealing, whatever it is that engages me. It kind of just fits into my aesthetic.
You like roses?
I do. They kind of appear everywhere.
You'd like them to appear everywhere?
They do kind of appear everywhere in different stories, and I mean, part of it's kind of
pretty romantic.
It's romantic, and they kind of just appear more and more, and it's almost like they're just like encompassing my work entirely. I had one short story where at the beginning of the story, I slowly start describing like roses that are in certain places, but by the end, they're just roses like that I describe everywhere. So you have the sense of this throughout the story, like a rose bush is actually growing around the mall. So it's one of those associations that I have, that it's like a clue that we're in now. You're in the magical world of Heather, or we're existing in a universe that's created by Heather, because I like roses, so there are just more roses everywhere. And it's just like those kind of hints. And it's like, and I always like the way that artists kind of play with motifs. And at some point I was like, well, it would be interesting to be able to write and have those motifs as well. And same thing, I mean, you can do it in poetry where you have like recurring images. So I was interested in doing that in prose.
Can Cézanne paint the same mountain about 1 million times?
Yeah, and so I wanted that almost.
Just as your sort of, that's your logo, your mark, your... Just finally then, your memoir. Mm-hmm. You're not too young to write a memoir. Why do you feel like writing that now? I
think in a way I was just curious what the process would be, and I was interested in the pushback that the book would give me. I don't know, it was a challenge, because I always see working with different books as a kind of relationship, and some books are just like more giving than others, and I kind of feel like I've been really getting along with fiction, and I understand like I'm good in that relationship now, and I know how to get a novel to like me back. So I was just kind of, part of me was just interested in, if I could, like I was talking about some traumatic events in my childhood, if I could, how they would like define me, and how I would find a way to put all that in words. And I'm not entirely sure I will be able to write it, but I'm just kind of, I was curious to open that like Pandora's box and see if it could be done.
Yeah, you get way more, I would think. I mean, with a novel you can say that's not me.
Yeah.
But if you do call it a memoir, then you're going to be vulnerable, I suppose. Like you're talking about, if I hear you correctly, events that were shattering. Mm-hmm. Is it sort of like public therapy? That might happen if you take the thing on the road to different festivals, no?
I suppose.
Not that it has to be honest,
yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. I never think of the end product, but it's just like a process thing, and I think it's also been in my mind as like something that I can never really actually talk about or articulate, and then I was kind of wondering if I could find words wherein to sort of capture the beast.
Yeah.
And then what an actual literary creative fiction, kind of using all those techniques, like what that would look like if you kind of put those together.
Yeah, because you can't lie. James Frey tried lying in his memoir, and look what happened to him. Because there's kind of a pact between the reader and the author.
Yeah.
You call it that, well, you better tell the damn truth.
There's some level of fabrication just in the way you kind of choose which events to put in, as we were talking about, because, anyway, it's going to kind of create a different picture. But, yeah, I think memoirs are an important genre because people look to them as these sort of intimate narratives about someone else's life to see how they've lived it, and people take all sorts of clues.
And they look for honesty.
Yeah,
really,
and they really look for honesty because you want to read.
They want to learn.
So, because there's, especially if you're having difficult experience, you want to read how someone else kind of went through that. It makes you not feel alone. So to lie about it is, it'd be just like it's too much of a betrayal.
But you said betrayal's okay if you're not alone, so.
I suppose, but
I'm just using your words against you. Sorry.
You're twisting my words.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say to your readers or to me?
No, I think I'm good. At some point I said, "For the love of God," maybe you should cut that out because it's a swear. But it's up to you.
Boy, you sound like you were raised in a really straight-laced environment.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to genuinely interact with me about your work. It was a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
I've been speaking to Heather O'Neill, who is the author, most recently, of Wisdom in Nonsense, Invaluable Lessons from My Father, published by the University of Alberta Press. You've been listening to the Bibliophile podcast. My name is Nigel Beale.